And good morning and welcome to The Claw, a broadcast of Liger Studios. I am Eric Holtzclaw at Law Partners, and I'm joined by she is consciously funded. So I think I disappeared for a second.
Yes, you're right.
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show this morning.
Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us. So tell me a little bit about Consciously Funded. What do you do?
Yes, so Consciously Funded is a social justice media company, and we're really looking to recenter and elevate the wisdom and current voices of Black and Indigenous social impact leaders. So throughout history, especially in social impact, the voice and work of Black and Indigenous people has just often been overlooked, lost, buried, and we often see this like white savior narrative, like we're coming in to save you kind of narrative. And so I just saw a lack of representation in the space, but I saw a lot of Black and Indigenous people on the ground doing the work in their community. And historically, like media was used heavily in the civil rights movement to make it successful. And media is kind of my sweet spot. And we'll talk a little bit, about my background. So I really wanted to use digital media technology to give these Black and Indigenous social entrepreneurs and impact investors a platform to really share their stories, promote their work, and then also realize equitable compensation, where we can bring these two groups together to really build the wealth and the assets in their own communities.
Very nice. So tell me about your background. So how did you end up in this position and doing?
Yeah, so this is a lifelong journey for me. I honestly didn't think I would be going back in media and entertainment. So I'm an Atlanta native, and I grew up in poverty, but I have an older sister that's 16 years older than me, and that's significant because as a kid, I saw her go through corporate America.
Right.
And so I decided really, really early, like, I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. I didn't really know what an entrepreneur was, but I just knew I wanted to have my own business and I didn't want to go to corporate America. But then also growing up in Atlanta, I grew up around educators and activists in the Atlanta University Center, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s alma mater is, Morehouse College. And we'll come to that. That's significant as well. So being around all of that growing up, I was heavily involved as a kid in sustainability initiatives. It just really fueled an early passion for me for justice and entrepreneurship. And so I ended up going to a historically Black college and university in Virginia called Hampton University, where Booker T. Washington is our prestigious alum. And also grew up in a musical family. So it's like all these things coming together. And I ended up changing my major in college to entrepreneurship. Hampton was one of the first HBCUs to have entrepreneurship as a major. And it just so happened that the chair of my department was a former venture capitalist. I had never heard that term before, but he taught us from that perspective. And so long story short, when I moved back to the city, I ended up pursuing graduate education. I got hired at Clark Atlanta to build out their innovation lab, and people were asking me to do pitch competitions and things like that. And I'm still kind of working in media and entertainment. I was a DJ. I worked on a few award shows. So, these worlds are kind of colliding. And as I was working on my doctorate, I just really felt like to make a bigger impact, it would be best for me to be in higher ed and really work with our young people. So I transitioned completely to higher ed, didn't think I was going to go back to media and entertainment. I ended up at Morehouse College. So that's what I said earlier, that was significant. I ended up at Morehouse College over student development in the business school. And while there, started a cohort of HBCU VC, which trains HBCU students to be venture capitalists.
Oh, nice.
So all these things, just kind of come in full circle. And so doing work in the community, working with students, meeting impact investors that were Black, because one of the things we did at HBCU VC, our students' first introductions to venture capital was people who look like them.
Yeah.
So I'm meeting these impact investors, but I'm also seeing these social entrepreneurs in the community doing the work and, just seeing this real lack of equity.
Right.
And understanding the role media has played in civil rights and justice, and helping people get their stories out. I just really wanted to be a solution to this false narrative. And research, I'm an academic, so research shows, that poverty and this systemic racism that we see, it costs our economy trillions of dollars a year, trillions of dollars. And less than 1% of Black and Indigenous founders get funding. Less than 1% of venture capitalists are Black or Indigenous. And so I really wanted to be a solution to those disparities and really, like I said, bring these communities together to build their own community. So it's just interesting how it worked out that my real early life, in the AUC at Morehouse College, at Clark Atlanta, in education and media, and now it's all kind of coming full circle. Yeah. So real short version about me.
Well, it's interesting, everything we do in our backgrounds ends up coming back somehow, right? Like
it does.
I had no idea that would ever be a thing. I love the fact that where you went to school had entrepreneurship.
Right.
They just thought I didn't want a job. Like, there's no such thing as that. They're like, oh, I would. Let's talk a little social. Find that word for us.
Yeah, so you went away a little bit, but I think you asked about social entrepreneurship and impact investing and define it. Okay, awesome. Yeah. So I define impact investing in social entrepreneurship really in the terms of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals and what we call the triple bottom line. Because many times people try to, align it with nonprofit work and say, oh, it's the exact same thing. So I usually kind of focus on that end to separate it. And the triple bottom line, we call that people, purpose, and planet. So impact investors are those who invest in businesses that are focused on a social cause or sustainable development goal. And while they're concerned about the financial return, they're also very much concerned about the impact that business is making on the community and making sure that business is having a positive impact and not harming people and not harming planet. And so it's the same thing with a social entrepreneur. They start a business for a profit, but it's focused on a social cause or a sustainable development goal. And they're looking at that triple bottom line. So a business that doesn't harm people, doesn't harm planet, but also makes a profit. And so I use the example that most people know, Tom Shoes. You sell a shoe and then they give a shoe away. And then also right here in Atlanta, we have a company called Gooder, where they take restaurants' good food that they would normally just throw out, and they're helping that company with their food waste. But then they take that good food and build meals and provide food for those who are experiencing food insecurity. So it's a way that they're making a profit, but they're also addressing a social issue. And then now we have this new corporate structure called Benefit Corporation that is popping up in states to really separate these social ventures from, your regular S corp or regular corporation. So that's kind of how I define it.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave examples, because I was going to be like, can you tell me an example? And I worked with the Emergency Food and Shelter Board for a period of time, and Meals on Wheels started to also sell. They would sell to certain people. So there's certain people who got the Meals on Wheels and then they would sell. And that was a way to kind of help them be self-sustaining. So kind of looking at that way of making that work. And so talk to me then about the narrative that you're bringing to light. Like, tell me about how you talked a little bit about the white savior who comes in and saves the day versus, things that are being done within social impact. So unpack that a little bit for me and give me some examples and how you're working to write that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, many people still don't really know about the social impact sector. It's still kind of like, when I talk to people, like, well, what is that? Right. So, still only a third of the global startups in the world are social impact ventures. But out of that, like I said, less than 1% of Black and Indigenous social impact ventures get funding. And then when you look at the executive leadership of those ventures, less than 10% of those social impact ventures have a person of color in executive leadership. So, there's disparities all around here with the
Crazy.
funding, with the leadership, with those who are in the community doing the work. But we understand that we have a saying that those who are closest to the problem are usually closest to the solution.
Yeah.
And so you don't need people coming into the neighborhood and saying, well, this is what you need to do to fix your neighborhood, right? This is what you need. There are assets in that community. There's a narrative, there's a history in that community that needs built. I did some work in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods here, but it was one of the neighborhoods here in Atlanta that was the first land to be given to freed slaves after the Civil War. It was where one of our top historically Black colleges and universities was founded, where a lot of the streets are named after former professors. But now it's one of the most impoverished neighborhoods. It's one of the zip codes that most of the felons in Georgia come from. And when you go into the neighborhood, the people are like, oh, we want to change the neighborhood. They often don't look like the people that are indigenous to that neighborhood. When I was there, when I started asking people, well, what's your vision for economic development for this neighborhood? Well, we just need more homeowners. Okay. But how's that going to provide jobs? How are the people who live here going to eat? Because there were no jobs in the area. There was no grocery store near the area. So they're just, because they weren't indigenous to that neighborhood, there was no real vision for what would improve that neighborhood, what would uphold the history of that neighborhood. And so I really feel like if we're really going to have a just and equitable world, like we really have to increase the capacity building resources around Black and Indigenous people in their own communities. I mean, when we talk about the Indigenous population, there's a long history of boarding schools and, the save the man but kill the Indian narrative, that type of thing. That still goes on today. I mean, you look at a group of people who at one point, I think were like 65 million people in the United States to now, I think they're like less than 0.5% of the population. That happened by genocide and murder and stealing and all those things. They're not like not reproducing anymore. That's not what's happening. There are other things that are happening too. You have Native American reservations in the United States. It's supposed to be the richest country in the world that don't have electricity and running water. Like that just doesn't make any sense to me. So, I really want to use media, podcasting, documentaries, whatever digital technology, I can use, even virtual reality to really expand these stories and get the work out, but also tell the stories of these impact investors that have money to provide solutions and really fund these equitable solutions. Because oftentimes those who are doing the work, they're going to organizations and getting funding that really just want them to just push their agenda, and they're not really looking to fund and really help the solution. And so that's what I'm really trying to address with Consciously Funded, and then telling the story inspires young people, right, to want to start these ventures, inspires young people to get into these organizations and aspire to these executive positions so we can have more than 10% of executives at the top of these companies.
Okay. Yeah. And so talking and correct me if I'm wrong here. So like when you talk about like, I like the example of going into a neighborhood and it's like, well, we need more homes, but you need an overall ecosystem, right? Like there are these food deserts where there's no grocery store. There's no way of like for people to kind of sustain or whatever. It's just a play, like it's a place for somebody to come in and get a house for cheap and try to make it better, right?
Okay.
Like make some money off of it. It's not really about correcting the area or the idea of, not pushing your own agenda. You're saying, again, don't let me put words in your mouth. Like it's somebody coming in and saying there was all the missionaries who went in and tried to convert people to Christianity, which is not really about helping the area out as much as kind of like they had a thing, right? That they do. Yeah.
And pushing that agenda. Yeah. And just not even upholding the culture, the native culture and just how many Native and Indigenous communities are losing their language, and they're having to restore their language and things of that nature. So, I just kept seeing, and it was one of those things, like I kept doing research and looking at organizations that were involved in this work and like, yep, no person of color in executive leadership. Yeah. Nope, the funders are not people of color. Like, okay, I'm going to have to address this.
Right. Well, no, that's crazy. That absolutely. So what is, there's the social impact investor or the impact investor, I guess, and the person that's doing the work. Is there is there a disconnect between the work that's being done and the fact that there's the opportunity to invest in it? Or is there a confusion in the fact that an investor doesn't know they could make that investment? Like, where's the disconnect, right? Because like I've watched lots and lots and lots of pitches, right? Like I've watched startup pitches over my entire career. There's typically like this disconnect of, knowing that the person with the money maybe be able to give you some connections, or they need to have some background in the space, right? So like, where do you see the disconnect between those two people?
Yes.
Make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. So I'll start with the social entrepreneur side. I think especially in our communities of color, a lot of social entrepreneurs still don't necessarily see themselves as that, because people still equate social impact with nonprofit, right?
Yeah.
And so
the concept of being a social entrepreneur is kind of like, they think they may be doing work, but it's not necessarily that like they're an actual entrepreneur.
Right. Yeah. So then there's not the thought that, oh, there are people that would invest in me and fund me.
Yeah.
Where it's not just donations. I don't just have to raise money from donations. So there's not that understanding that venture capital funding is available for what they're doing. But then on the impact investor side, while they typically an impact investor know, that the areas of work that need to be invested in, but they often don't have the entrepreneurs that are indigenous to that area, that community in their networks, because venture capital is a very network driven kind of space, So there was a study that outside of just impact investing, but venture capital as a whole, 40% of venture capital investors come from Stanford and Yale.
Oh, wow. What's the percentage?
40%.
Wow, that's a big percentage.
Yes, come from Stanford and Yale. And so then most of your top CEOs that have received venture capital funding come from Stanford and Yale.
Right.
So, and most of your social entrepreneurs who are really indigenous to the communities and doing the work, they're not in those networks. They're not in those Ivy League networks. And so, there's this disconnect sometimes of the impact investors knowing where to go to find these entrepreneurs. They typically go to your chambers and your entrepreneur networking events, or like SoCap is a big conference everyone goes to, but many times the people who are truly close to the problem are not at those events. I mean, SoCap is kind of an expensive conference to go to. So
right.
So they're not at those events. So there are other networks, and that's because I've been in the historically Black college space. I think I've been a little bit more privy to where those networks are that impact investors can connect with those entrepreneurs in that work.
Okay, so making sure that you're getting them to mingle in the right places, right? So
right.
They know where to go, because that's a big deal. Like we have a new employee at our company who just moved to Atlanta, and like I'm telling her you need to go to this meeting and you got to go to that meeting, and that's right. Just like I've been in Atlanta forever, right? So I'm like, hey, go to this place, and then really interestingly thinking about, because I have some friends I've talked with a lot about, there's a difference between building an organization where you have to always go raise money for it, and building something that's self-sustaining, which is sort of how an entrepreneur thinks about it. So like, how do I build, like I'm doing social impact, and you can do it in a way that's like, has like a legacy to it, right? Like it has a legacy to what it does, and but they may not think of themselves that way. That's really
a lot. And what I kept seeing is a lot of social entrepreneurs, they would just bootstrap, to the end of their resources, and then they get burnt out and quit.
Yeah.
Because they just run out of runway. They run out of cash flow. And not many times it's not that it wasn't a good idea, that it wasn't making an impact, that it wasn't helping people. They just ran out of money, or they couldn't hire the personnel they needed to do the work. So if we can combine these two groups and get them to know that each other exists and where they exist, and that's part of the using media to tell those stories, because it's like, okay, where are you doing the work? How did you get into this? Where do you hang out? Where, and the impact investors, what are you funding? What area are you funding? What's your, area of focus? Because that's the other thing I found working with entrepreneurs that do know about venture capital investor or impact investor. They just go to any investor. Yeah. And not understanding that you really need to look for an investor that, one, has experience investing in your space, but then two, that is aligned with your company's vision. Because otherwise, I mean, an investment relationship is a long-term relationship. Yes. So otherwise, it's going to be a nightmare if that person is not aligned
That's such good, it's so funny to think about it from that perspective, because that's such good advice. You don't just want the money. Like, you do not want the money. You want
a partner.
Yeah, the partner that's like, if you watch Shark Tank and you understand how they're selecting the person that they think is going to move them along. Yeah, the money is important, but it's really about who do you know and what's the connection going to look like. So finding the right person who understands the vision and getting that together. Okay. And so with what you're doing, so you've got a series of media platforms that you're launching or have launched that help to kind of tell the stories about.
Yes, so actually launching our podcast in the next day or two.
Okay, nice.
We've been interviewing and kind of getting those in. I'm actually starting this first season of the podcast focus on impact investors, because that's where the gap is of people understanding how that works. So we're focusing on impact investors for the first season, and then we'll talk to the entrepreneurs and even some academics that are doing the work, and looking to do some documentary series because the other thing, like most of these people are HBCU alum or tribal college alum. We have tribal colleges just like we have HBCUs. And like, I'll use Martin Luther King as an example because that's who everyone knows. We always talk about him going to Morehouse. But then who are the current Morehouse alum that are continuing the work and carrying that torch of Dr. Martin Luther King? They exist. Those people exist, but we don't hear their stories. Because one of the things that was different during Dr. Martin Luther King's time is that we had our own media outlets. We had our own TV shows, our own newspapers, our own radio stations. We don't currently have that anymore. Wow. So our stories are not being told. The stories of the masses and the majority is what's being told. So a lot of these grassroots on the ground stories are not being told. Dr. Martin Luther King was successful because whenever he had a march, he would call the Black media outlets to meet him there, to cover it. And they would cover it, and then the larger news organizations would cover it. And so that's what I'm looking to do, is like create this grassroots media platform that can cover these grassroots initiatives that are really doing good and elevating communities so that they can thrive.
So what happened to the platforms? Did they just get bought up, or like the ones that they used to exist?
Yes, some of them got bought out. Some of them ran out of money. There's always that issue.
It's always money, right? Yeah.
Because I think, it's just now in the last few years where people are seeing the return on investing in communities of color, right? Before it was like, well, we don't see how we'll get the return on that, because they're just a small percentage of the population. It's like, no, but we got a lot of buying power. Right. So, So I think people just in the last few years are really starting to see the value in investing. And then you've had bad deals. It's kind of the same thing I said, where people have gotten into funding partnerships with people who then, because they had the majority share, because they put up the money, they changed the whole focus, of the business venture. I mean, I've heard, especially those who get venture capital funding, where you bring on a venture capital investor and then they fire you as a CEO.
Wow.
And then hire another CEO that they think will, scale the company to where they want it to go to get their return. Yeah. So those things happen. But I mean, like most of our magazines, I mean, we see it in the news, Jet, Essence, those magazines, they've lost money and had to be bought out and things of that nature. Radio One has had issues. So yeah, our platforms have had issues.
Very interesting. So it's an interesting combination. Again, you talk about like background and things that have happened. Like this conversation for me has been very interesting because I'm connecting some dots, right? Some things like, because kind of lived in different parts of it, but never had put those dots together for some reason. So So how do people find out about what you're doing and support you and make sure that your efforts work so that then you can support others?
Absolutely. So they can go to my website, consciouslyfunded.com. The episodes that we recorded will be up soon. I am on all social media platforms. So Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Consciously Funded. And then, Twitter gives you that limit of your name. So, so I had to do Conscious Funded on Twitter without the LY. But we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. And I'm trying to get my YouTube followers up so I can get an actual Consciously Funded YouTube page name. But if you search YouTube Consciously Funded, then you'll find me. But, they haven't given me my URL yet.
Understood. Very nice. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you this morning. Thank you so much for coming on to The Claw, which is a part of the Liger Studios podcast network, and we'll get you introduced to some other people so you can do some interviews with them as well. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate it.
I've been joined this morning by Lavonya Jones. She is with Consciously Funded. You can find out all of her information on our page, and we'll connect to all of her links and things like that. Make sure you go listen to her podcast and watch her videos, and let's keep the conversation going.